Hello and welcome to Eye on Africa, your top stories on the continent tonight. 60 years ago today, French and Algerian officials inked a peace deal, the Évian Accords, bringing an end to an 8-year war and paving the way for Algerian independence. A 19-year-old says that she was raped by Sudanese security forces on the sidelines of a protest. Rights groups fear sexual violence is being used as a weapon of war. And we bring you a report on Ugandan efforts to track down an Islamist militia called the ADF, an operation that takes them into neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo. But first, today marks the 60th anniversary since the signing of the Évian Accords, a peace deal between Algeria's provisional government and France, one that ended an 8-year war and paved the way for Algerian independence. 250 to 400,000 people died during that war on the Algerian side, and around 30,000 people died on the French side, as well as tens of thousands of Harkis, those indigenous Algerians who had fought alongside the French during the conflict. The Évian deal promised a referendum on self-determination for Algeria, eventually bringing an end to 132 years of colonial rule.
Talks to end the 8-year war in Algeria came after months of secret negotiations. Terrorist attacks in Algiers and Paris early 1962 convinced the last hesitant officials to get on board. On March 7, 1962, representatives from the French government and the National Liberation Front came together in Évian, with mainly two sticking points: the future of French nationals wishing to remain in Algeria, which was not resolved in the agreement, and who would control the Algerian Sahara. France managed to remain in charge for several years in that region, strategic for the oil industry and the development of nuclear weapons. The Évian agreements were signed on the 18th of March. A ceasefire took effect the next day.
The measures have been adopted so that the people can control their own destiny.
But the fighting continued for several months, with attacks carried out by the OAS, made of mainly former French soldiers opposed to Algeria's independence, and by the Algerian National Liberation Front. No matter the situation on the ground, Algeria's journey to independence was in motion. The French and Algerians backed the principle in referendums. But on the day that independence was due to become official, European and pro-French Algerians were massacred in Oran. Terrified of facing new massacres, the Europeans fled Algeria. They were joined by some 10,000 Harkis, Algerians who fought alongside the French. The Harkis who remained in their home country were targeted repeatedly. Those repatriated, whether French or of Algerian descent, remain scarred by the killings until today.
And to discuss this symbolic date with us, Sarah Dekish joins me on the show. She's the co-director of a new anthology book with 15 authors, including herself, writing about the different aspects of the Algerian war, from the fight for independence and how history is remembered afterwards, as well as questions on identity. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. You co-directed this book, and you have a conference on this topic coming up this weekend. Why did you choose to embark on this project?
Well, my starting point was probably very selfish. It's that as a French Algerian growing up in Switzerland, I always felt, or since a long time feel, that this double identity is influenced by the history between France and Algeria. It's, of course, very present. I see, on the one hand, still a lot of suffering coming up from time, frustrations, or maybe also silences. On the other hand, a lot of unknown also areas. And that has always been a question mark for me, always something I have been observing, questioning. And with the time, I also realized that I was not the only one, that also other people that have this relationship to this history, whether they are Harkis, as it was mentioned just earlier, or their children, or Pieds Noirs, so these French people who lived in this territory and who had to come back to the France metropolitan, and others, maybe there is a common denominator which is made of some suffering, some frustrations, still a lot of taboo, still a lot of things that are unknown and that generate this suffering. And so I realized that this is probably a common denominator. And while we are today in a moment, I think a very important moment, where also politically there is some willingness to bring closer again France and Algeria, to reopen a bit this history and to make also a real historical work on that, I had the impression, and I'm convinced, that this will also happen if the people are involved, and that involves a dialogue between these different memoirs, these different remembrances, these different stories. And this is what I wanted to do through the event and through the book.
And like you just mentioned there, the war is deeply personal to people like yourself, to many Algerians and many French people. 60 years on, why do you think that some of these groups that you mentioned, the Harkis, the Pieds Noirs, why do they have such varying memories of the past?
Well, first of all, it's normal. It has been, 132 years of colonization, 8 years of war, a war that ended indeed 60 years ago, which is a long time ago, and at the same time, not that long. So it's normal. It's a very complex situation. So it's also normal that sufferings are still there. It's a process that takes time. But I think that it is especially important and present still today because of these silences, because I think probably every group has been treated differently. There has been trauma. So these French people who left from one day to another, it's a trauma for them. They have not been very well received when they came back in France, although it was the same country, but they were perceived as foreigners. Algerians who then had to rebuild their country, some of them came in France with also sometimes difficult situations, etc., Harkis, etc. So every group faced its own difficulties, and there has been a lot of taboos, there has been a lot of suffering, and I think also politically and institutionally, maybe a lack of recognition. And this lack of recognition, of course, doesn't help to recover and to close a wound.
You were saying earlier that you thought there was a political impetus these days. Emmanuel Macron has acknowledged that French troops tortured and killed pro-independence militants as well as anti-independence protesters in Algiers. What's your opinion on his work so far?
Well, I think he's done quite a lot, and he's a president who. He's born also after the war, so it's not something he has known, but he has done quite a lot. I think his efforts are quite significant compared also to what has been done before. His efforts maybe even come a bit late. It's a pity that this has not been done before. We had to wait for the 90s to have the Algerian war really being named as a war and not an event. So I think his efforts are very important. The work that he has also commissioned, the historian Benjamin Stora, who submitted his report last year, is very important. And also the symbols that he is putting behind his gestures to recognize certain events, to recognize specific dates, is very important. And at the same time, one also sees that now also being electoral period in France, sometimes one wonders whether he doesn't try to please everyone at the same time. So it's at the same time a real step, at the same time also sometimes question marks as well, I would say.
All right, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Sarah Dekish, for joining us on Eye on Africa.
Thank you.
Let's turn our attention next to Sudan. A 19-year-old woman there says that she was gang raped in Khartoum by security forces. The head of the country's official violence against women unit says that she wasn't taking part in Monday's rally, but that protesters took her to a nearby hospital after the act. There have been daily protests since, with demonstrators handing out flyers saying, quote, "Wars are not fought on women's bodies." Laurent Berstecker has the story.
The 19-year-old Sudanese woman was sitting on a bus in Khartoum when the vehicle was stopped by security forces. On the lookout for anti-government protesters, they started firing tear gas inside, causing the passengers to flee. But as the young woman tried to get away, she says she was grabbed by the officers and brutally gang-raped.
They dragged me underneath the bridge and removed all my clothes. There were about 8 men around me, and I kept on screaming to them, "Let me go," but they just said no and they beat me.
It's not the first time allegations of rape have been brought against Sudanese security forces. In December, the UN received a dozen similar complaints after police attempted to disperse a public sit-in in Khartoum. News of the 19-year-old's assault, which took place on Monday, sparked fresh protests throughout the week, as thousands of Sudanese took to the streets to condemn the use of sexual violence as a weapon.
We are here today to denounce the oppression and the rapes. We reject the military rule. The people behind this coup will surely fall. We will never be silenced by rape or arrests.
Sudan has been rocked by near-daily protests since the government was overthrown by a military coup in October. In response, authorities unleashed a bloody crackdown, which left at least 80 people dead. But rather than deterring protesters, the violence has triggered even more anger and demonstrations against the military government.
And finally, Ugandan troops have been conducting a mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an effort to track down an Islamist militia called the ADF. If previous Ugandan operations there were controversial, this time Kinshasa has given them the green light. Yesterday, we took you to North Kivu. Today, we head to Rwenzori Mountains and Virunga National Park. Our regional correspondent Bastien Renouy gained exclusive access.
A demonstration of strength by Ugandan soldiers in front of our cameras. No militia was spotted on the Rwenzori Mountains that day. But according to them, the ADF recently went into hiding in the mountains.
Today is our 10th day in this location. This is our patrol base. It has been set up temporarily, simply because this is one of the areas that the enemy conducts its operations by killing the locals, looting property, and also conducting other atrocities.
The army says it has killed 16 militia here in the last 10 days. The group attacked Luanoli village on January 12th, causing its residents to flee.
Ça, c'était le bloc de maternité du centre de santé de Luanoli.
Everything inside was looted and destroyed.
We could hear the sound of heavy and light weapons. They also destroyed some residential buildings, somewhere up there. Today we're back in Luanoli because security is guaranteed by 2 armies, the UPDF from Uganda and the FARDC from Congo.
The Ugandan army was deployed to stop these attacks in a large part of North Kivu territory, and here in the Virunga National Park. The head of the intelligence cell shares an update on the troops' advances.
ADF had occupied this Abia, Kambia, Yua. These were the first ADF locations. They have moved away. As we talk, a force is on ground.
To prove its success, the army shows off its spoils of war.
These are the guns that were captured in this operation we are talking about.
The colonel then brings in these 3 child soldiers captured during the conflict. They're 13, 15, and 17 years old. To prove that they belong to the ADF, the soldiers order them to assemble these AK-47s.
You should be in school. We'll take you back to school.
It's not possible for us to see the seized ADF militia camps, but the army claims to be stamping out the rebels. Some residents are more skeptical and worry that they're only pushing the gunmen further away from the Ugandan border into other Congolese provinces.
That's it for Eye on Africa. More international news coming up next.
The The French presidential election is just around the corner, and what better excuse to embark on a road trip across the country in an electric 2CV, a car full of contradictions just like France itself. As voters weigh up their options, we'll be exploring the major themes of this election, everything from healthcare and culture to security and the economy. We'll be travelling north, south, east and west, including a trip to the French overseas territory of Guadeloupe. See you on the road.
France 2022, the road trip, across all France 24 channels and on France24.com.